All right, so if you have your Bible with you, I would ask you to take it to Exodus chapter 6. And we are going to pick up our story where we were a couple weeks ago. Moses and Aaron and the children of Israel, before any of God's delivering plagues had begun, they are in this in-between moment. Today I called what we're looking at faithful failures. And I think that's a really powerful thing for us to understand. I think it's very key to not getting stuck in despair, in darkness, and in discouragement, understanding what it means to be a faithful failure. And so we're going to look at this from the life of Moses and Aaron today. And as we kind of get our heads into that gear, this may be a long time ago for some of you, but just pretend that it wasn't. How many of you remember when you were learning to ride a bike? Remember that experience? Okay. I remember trying to learn to ride a bike and like this hard riddle of what does it mean to have balance on a bike. You know, it was kind of, how do you figure that out? How do you understand what it means? Most of us learned by sticking with the attempts even after a few falls, or maybe a lot of falls. I remember better teaching my kids to ride bikes. I remember my girls kind of learned together. There was a lot of running and some crying, but they didn't let that stop them from asking me for help anyway, even though I was like, I can't do it anymore. I've run all I can run. But they both kind of learned together. Dylan really had no interest in learning to ride a bike because he couldn't do it right the first time. So like, what's the point? Like if I don't know how to do it right away, then I don't even care, right? But what sticks with me is when Dustin learned to ride a bike, because we had this little, it was a very gentle slope off the back of our garage. And he just decided one day that it was time to learn to ride a bike. So he got this little bike out, and he got backed up to the garage, and he just started riding down this slope. And I watched him. It was like an hour. And like 15, 20 feet every time. Boom, 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 just down on the ground. And I thought, I'm just sitting there as a dad, because he's our fourth, so we're much less involved. We're like, he's still living, it's okay, right? But I remember thinking, I wonder how long it will take before he asks for help or gives up, right? And he just kept backing the bike up and down the hill and eventually I looked up one time and he's riding around the backyard. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. He learned to ride he just decided, I'm going to do it. And he stuck with it no matter what. I'm not sure that I always have that kind of confidence in my life, or that kind of endurance in my life. I think it's a very valuable thing, but sometimes it's hard to get. Do you know what I mean? Where even though you fall and you fall and you fall, you believe that I'm still going to get there, I'm still going to figure it out, I'm going to find a way to make it work. It's hard to keep doing something when it doesn't seem like it's working. And most of the time, when it doesn't seem like it's working, it makes us question both our ability and our set of answers. Like, can I do this? Or am I even right that I should be trying to do this? Spiritually speaking, that happens too. In our spiritual lives and in our spiritual walk, we kind of like fall, and when we fall and we fall and we fall, especially when we're trying to do the right thing, it can make us question, maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe I'm not a good enough Christian. Maybe I'm not strong enough. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I thought I knew way, but it turns out I don't really know that way. So we started to self-doubt. We started to getting stuck in this cycle. And you come to church and you look at all these people who seem to know what they're doing. Maybe you don't envy them or look up to them, but they all seem like they generally have a life that isn't falling apart. And you come in and you just try to pretend like yours isn't falling apart either. Right? And so we all put this front on, but the reality is, if we had that x-ray to see everyone's life, all of us face deep disappointment. All of us face really hard times, deep sorrow, an overwhelming discouragement, the times where it feels like I just have to throw in the towel. No matter what zone that is, whether it's a career zone or a parenting zone or a marriage zone or just a spiritual, emotional zone, all of us know that feel. And it feels like as hard as we try to press forward, nothing ever changes. And nothing ever gets better. Does anybody feel that? I keep trying and I keep trying. How long can you keep doing what's right when it doesn't seem to be doing anything? How long can you just get back up and roll the bike back and try again? Do I just not know how to read the Bible? Do I just not know how to pray? I don't know what's the problem. I mean, there was something wrong that I was doing, and I stopped doing it, and I expected it to make it better, but it actually seemed to get worse. I decided to start doing some things that I always knew I should do. I'm going to make church a priority. I'm going to read my Bible, but nothing changes. Is there some secret that I'm missing that everybody else seems to know, but I can't put my finger on? And we get there again and again and again. As a parent, are they ever going to get it? I had to adopt a mindset in raising our kids that I just had decided somewhere along the way that it takes 5,000 times of saying something for my kids to get it. That way, when they got it at like number 352, I was like, they're geniuses. But just the endurance, the mindset of to continue on because you say it and you say it and you do it and you do it and it doesn't do anything. I go to work every day and I keep doing a good job and I try to do my best and nobody notices and nobody says anything and I don't get ahead. I try to, beginning of the year, start eating right and living right and exercising and whatever, but I don't see any change and I'm not sure it's going to make it and nobody around me is really supportive of it. And so all of that is what we're talking about. I'm hoping to encourage some of you today. I'm hoping to remind you, if this is you at any point in your life, I'm hoping to remind you that your hope is still sure. That what you do still matters. That your choices are making a difference, even if it doesn't seem like it yet. Because our God is faithful. Because our God is true. Because our God sees, and because our God is our deliverer. The story where we pick up, Moses and Aaron have obeyed. And because of their obedience, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. The children of Israel have suffered. So last time when we got together 2 weeks ago, Moses came to God and said, God, what's the deal? How is this okay? I did what you asked me to, and it got worse. Why are you playing this trick on us? And God's answer to him, we saw, was a renewed promise. I will act. And what he does by that promise is he gives Moses another chance to act in faith. Another chance to do the right thing. I'm talking about being a faithful failure like Moses and Aaron. They failed. They went in. They said what they were supposed to do. They were faithful, and it failed. And then they asked God, did we get it wrong? What's going on? Will what we're doing ever make a difference? And the rest of this story through Exodus is here for our encouragement. Because even though that's where we are right now, and it feels somewhat like an end, it isn't the end of your story. And it wasn't the end of Moses and Aaron's story. Even though I can identify with it as a human being, I've got to look at what this story is teaching us. Their story is here to instruct us and to encourage us. So in Exodus chapter 6, verse 10 to 12, this is at the end of Moses going to the Israelites and saying, but God has promised this, and they said they won't listen to him because of the labor and their discouragement. So verse 10, then the Lord said to Moses, go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country. But Moses said to the Lord, if the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? God had just given Moses this renewed promise. No, you didn't hear me wrong. It's still the right thing to do. It's still the right way to go. You still did what I asked you to do. You were faithful. And I'm asking you, God says to Moses, I'm asking you to continue to believe that I will do everything that I told you. I will free my people from the bondage of slavery. I will do this. Just because it didn't work doesn't mean you didn't do it right. That's a hard thing for us to digest. Just because it didn't work doesn't mean you didn't do it right. Doesn't mean that you were not doing exactly what you were supposed to do. And so how do I know that? Because what God asks Moses to do now is exactly what he asked him to do before. It's exactly the same thing. Moses goes, it didn't work, God. What's plan B? And God goes, plan B is plan A. Keep doing what I told you to do, even though it didn't work. Can you imagine having obeyed and then having it all blow up? It strikes at the core of how we relate to God, our faith. I went forward because the promise of God said, I'll use you. And I believed that God was good and that he's going to set things right. And I want to make a difference. I want to be used. I want to be a part of this. I want to change this. And then when I do what God asked me to do, everything falls apart. And then God says, now go do that again. Faithful even when you fail. Why would something that is right fail? Why would God ask you to do something that won't work? I don't know that I have the full answer to that, but I do know this. As you read through the Word of God, God does this a lot of times with people. He asks people to do something, and then it doesn't work. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, prophets sent to God's people to call them to repent, to call them to turn, to say to them, you're going the wrong way. Stop acting like idiots and start being people of God. And those are some of the longest books in the Bible, certainly some of the longest books in the Old Testament. Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet because he went to the people and he cried for them. And the history of their story is, it didn't work. Isaiah, big time. We still read, every Christmas we read the words Isaiah wrote, but Isaiah died believing nothing worked. The people never listened. And so we see these things. Even Jesus sent to his own people, but his own people reject him instead of receiving him. And so what we learn is this: we should not be surprised when God asks us to do something and that thing fails. It doesn't mean that it was pointless. It doesn't mean it didn't have purpose. It doesn't mean that we're doomed. It just means that God is working on a larger scale than just this minute. God is working on a bigger scheme than just this week. God sees further than just this lifetime. And so when God asks you to be faithful, you can trust his plan, even if it doesn't seem like it's working. And so God says to Moses, go do it again. What he's doing with Moses and Aaron is teaching them about faithfulness. That even when it seems like doing the right things fail, be faithful, be obedient to what I've asked you to do. Sometimes we think the point of God asking us to do something is the results that we think we're going to get. But what I learn as I watch this is the point of God asking me to do something is whether or not I will trust him enough to do it. Not whether or not I am managing the outcomes. That's God's business. Whether or not I trust him enough to do it. It's about faith. It's about trust. It's about the strength that I need and others need for this life, that I would keep going even when it seems like I don't have reason to. It's about growing in my faith, which is believing without seeing. Some of us long for a faith, or we would like to define faith as believing because I see. The Bible does not define faith as believing because I see. It defines faith as believing without seeing. And so when God asks me to do something and I'm faithful to what he asked me to do, even when it doesn't work, it is believing without seeing. I'm sure in this moment, it didn't feel like hope to Moses. It didn't feel like this is going to work out. It felt pointless. It even felt dangerous. And so Moses says to the Lord, if the Israelites wouldn't listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me? Moses says, God, like I'm game to do what you asked me to do, but this makes no sense. Because after you told me your promise, I went, just the verse before this, after you told me the promise, I went back to your people and told them, God says he's going to set you free. And they said, no. And now you said, good job, Moses. Go talk to Pharaoh too. And Moses says, if your own people won't listen to you, how in the world is it make any sense for me to go to the king of Egypt? Obvious facts. Clearly, I've been rejected by both audiences. This is just not my thing. I don't have the spiritual gift of talking or whatever. I can't do this. This is not my thing. Why would God ask him to go do it again? Do you remember a story in the New Testament when the disciples were in a boat and they were fishing all night, but they caught nothing? Remember that story? They're out all night fishing, and they are professional fishermen, but all night long they catch nothing, and it's embarrassing, and it's frustrating, and they are tired. And Jesus shows up on the shore, and he says, "Hey, have you caught anything?" Very encouraging. And they say, "No, we haven't caught anything." And he says, "Hey, try throwing the net on the other side of the boat." Can you imagine being the professional fisherman? And Jesus says, "Hey, try throwing the net on the other side of the boat." Like, oh, the other side of the boat. If only I had known there were two sides to the boat. We would have. What's he doing? Failure all night long, followed by a success so large it couldn't be contained by the boat that they were in. Why does God do that? He did it with the disciples to show them who Jesus is and to show them how this was all going to work. It wasn't going to work by logic. It wasn't going to work by skill. It wasn't going to work by the strength of man. It was going to work by the power of God. And that was the thing that they needed to endure what was coming, because they were going to do the right thing and get thrown in prison by the religious leaders, by God's people. They were going to do the right thing and suffer the end of their lives. They were going to be beaten. They were going to be persecuted. They were going to see loved ones hurt and harmed. How do you hold on? You hold on when you recognize it's not about any of that, because this is the power of God here. And we can be faithful that God is going to do something, because even though remember that night when we fished all night and Jesus showed up and all of a sudden there were more fish? That failure in their faithfulness over the night was the setup to understand that God's power is what they needed. Even in something they knew well, it was God's power that they needed. And here we find Moses and Aaron. Their failure, according to God, is not a reason to throw in the towel. It was a setup to God's plan being more clearly shown and understood. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if Moses had been a great orator and had convinced Pharaoh on the first time with his wonderful argument, with his powerful presentation, there would be some confusion about what made it happen. But Moses failing, and then failing again, and then failing again. By the way, there's a lot more failures after this. I think there's like 9 more. Each failure is a way for God's power to be more seen and more understood. And when deliverance comes, for it to be clear, so abundantly clear, that God was the one who did it, that God was great, and that God was good. And God used Moses' failure as a part of his plan to do exactly what needed. Moses' weakness was exactly what God needed, so that his people, that he was calling to himself, would know his presence. That God is here, and that God's people would know his power. They had to endure some discouragement. They had to endure some dark moments. But in those processes, in those experiences, what they were set up for is understanding something they would have never understood before. Instead of Moses, "Oh, Moses, you're such a wonderful hero. I can't believe you said that. Oh, you did a great job. How did you convince Pharaoh?" It was like, Moses, clearly you didn't convince Pharaoh. You tried again and again and again, but clearly God convinced Pharaoh. And they gave glory to God. They became God's people. The verses that follow that verse are a lot about the generations to come, the first 3 sons of Israel, and specifically Moses and Aaron's lineage. But then we get down to verse 26, and it kind of picks it up again, because Moses says, "Why would Pharaoh speak to me since I speak with faltering lips?" And so then we come back to it. So verse 26. It was this Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, "Bring the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions." They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. This same Moses and Aaron. Now when the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt, he said to him, "I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I tell you." But Moses said to the Lord, "Since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me?" God lays out the plan again. Moses says, "No thanks." God comes back and says, "No, we're going to go over this one more time." And he actually puts a highlight on Moses' inability to speak. He says, you and your brother Aaron will be, verse 26. God says to him, go back and tell the king of Pharaoh everything I tell you. But Moses says to the Lord, since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me? What you hear from Moses is what you would expect. He's just scared. He's just flat out scared. He's convinced it won't do any good. Moses doesn't want to be the cause of his people's suffering. He doesn't want to see me go into Pharaoh and things get worse still. He doesn't want to be the guy who is a fool for trusting in God only to find out that God doesn't do what he expected. What I will tell you is this. God's call to faithfulness, enduring failure, is what challenges our self-doubt. When God asks us to be faithful, even though it doesn't work, it's challenging to our self-doubt, which really is connected to our doubt in God's ability to make it clear to us what he's promised and what he's asking us to do. What I mean by this is this. A lot of times we say, well, I don't know what God wants me to do. I don't know what God wants me to do. I wish God would just tell me what to do. I will tell you this about God. Don't believe this lie. This is a way the enemy wants to keep you stuck. God will tell you what to do. If you don't know what to do, it's probably because he already told you what to do and you said no. Or you said not enough. No, I want to make some things happen. I want to get moving. I want to go forward. I want to see progress. And God said, this is not the time for progress. This is time for faithfulness. This is time for your trust to endure. This is time for you to believe in me and just go forward. We get into self-doubt. I don't know, really because we don't know that God is able to make stuff clear to us. We think like we have to solve some Rubik's Cube, some giant puzzle to figure out, I don't know how to do it. Instead of believing that God, who is good, who is our Father, who loves us, loves to make it clear to us what we should do. God does not hide his will from us. God reveals his will to us, and he asks us to be faithful. And sometimes what confuses us is that he's asking us to believe him, not to believe in the results. He's asking us to trust him, not to trust our understanding of what's going to happen because of it. And the enemy pounces on this. He loves to spin us around in endless cycles of doubt. Oh, I just need a little more info. Oh, maybe I was mistaken. Oh, if only God really asked me to do this or that. But the reality is, if you are wrong, you will know it if you ask God. If you're on the wrong path, you will know it if you ask the Lord, because he desires to make his will known to you. And he's not up in heaven going, I wish I could just think how to get through to you. How do I? He knows exactly how to make it clear to you what he wants you to do. And then you have the choice of doing it or not. He has made it very clear to Moses what he should do. Moses spins back to the same question. I don't even talk very well. I don't know why you want me to do this. I see the problem that will doom this. It's always going to fail. You ask me to speak, but speaking itself is my weakness. I don't speak well. And so God simplifies. God simplifies the plan and he says, just tell Pharaoh whatever I tell you. Just tell him whatever I tell you. And then he goes on to lay out a bigger plan. Verse 1 of chapter 7 down to verse 7, it says this, Then the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I will multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. God lays out the plan and he says, here's the deal. Moses, I know you can't speak, But guess what? That's going to be a plus and not a minus. I will make you God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. It's going to work just like I work with my people, where I speak to my prophets and my prophets, and they're supposed to listen to the prophet because I have the authority. I'm giving you that kind of divine mandate, that kind of divine authority with Pharaoh. You will speak him through Aaron, and he will have to listen to Pharaoh, and to Aaron. And if he doesn't listen to Aaron, he will pay the price. He will face the judgment, and I will pour judgment out on him. And it all boils down to simple obedience. There's no tricky stuff here. It's just, will you believe and do it or not? There's no wrestling for Moses to do about how to best present this argument. Now, Moses, I want you to stay up all night. I want you to write out 4 or 5 drafts, and I want you to make the best possible. He doesn't have any of that. He says, just tell him what I tell you. Say, let my people go. This isn't tricky. It's just about, will you believe or not? Sometimes our stress level is because we have way too much confidence and faith in our ability to make the difference. And so we're all about, how am I going to do it, and what am I going to say, and what am I going to do, and how am I going to make that happen? God simplified it for Moses. Just do what I tell you, and I'll make sure that the right stuff comes from it. You can understand why Moses would think that his words needed to have an impact, why he needed to be a good speaker. That seemed to be. But it turns out what God says to him is, your words won't work anyway. Even if you pick the best words, they're going to have the impact that they're supposed to have, which is to fail. Pharaoh will say no, and he will say no again and again. The seeming failure of this work, of this task, actually was meant to bring more from God than would have happened otherwise. In other words, God says, I'm going to do that, I'm going to have that, that's going to be the way that it is, because it's going to allow me to pour out mighty acts on them so that everyone will know, time and time again. It will be beyond reason for anyone to think, wow, we just had a bad week. It won't be like that. Because time after time, Moses is going to walk in and say, this is going to happen, and then it happens. And destruction throughout Egypt. And it's like, wow, God poured it out. How did he do that? Through the failure of Moses and Aaron. Again and again and again. But they were faithful even though they failed. Could God ask you to do something that will fail again and again and again? Yeah. Why? Because the point is the faith that it takes to do it and to trust what comes from it to God. If God asks me to do it, then I do it. I don't worry about if it worked or not. I do it. I worry about if I've been faithful or not. Because my job is not to make sure I didn't fail. My job is to make sure I've been faithful. And that's what they do. Verse 6, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. They made a choice and they acted in faith. And the implication is that they did this over and over. Every time that Pharaoh said no and a plague came and they came back and he said no, they had to come back to this decision and say, we're still going to be faithful even though it failed. And a little side note before we get to communion today. The thing ends by saying Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83. Let me just say a little side note here. Moses lives in his life to 120 years old. We find that in Deuteronomy 34. Aaron lives in his life to 123. That's found in Numbers 33. So basically, 2/3 of their life have passed before they begin their purpose. 2/3 of their life passes before they even begin their purpose. And if you look up the statistics today of what it means in America, what the average age, that means that they would be about 52 years old before they started their purpose. And I'm saying this not because of a specific age. I'm just saying because we live in a society that worships youth. And I want to say this to young and old. You are not too old to be used by God. You are not too old to matter. You are not too old to have an impact for the kingdom of Jesus. And you are not too young. How can we read the story of Moses and not get that the message that seems to be what is a disadvantage to you, even age, could be used as an advantage? This whole thing where it's like, well, that's old people stuff, and that's young people stuff, and this generation, and well, your generation, and okay, boomer, and all that stuff. That is not us. That is not the people of God. Do you understand what I mean? We don't write people off because they're too old or too young. God doesn't write people off because they're too old or too young. We are not about what's cool and hip and up to date. We are about being faithful to God. I don't care, let me say this as nicely as I can. I don't care what you think of me. I care what you think of him. And so if I make a fool of myself, but you glorify God, isn't that something that I'm supposed to be like fully in on? So let's stop with all of the stuff where it's like, well, what's everybody think of me? And I'm too old for this, and I'm too young, and no one will listen to me because I'm a whatever. Let's stop opting out, excusing ourselves because of what society that doesn't know God thinks about us. Can we do that? Let's be people who are faithful to God. This was never about whether it would work or not work. This was about doing what I was asked to do, being a part of the process that God designed for Israel's deliverance and connection. God says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to build my people. And I'm saying to you today, faithfulness is worth it. Even if my actions fail, faithfulness is worth it. God is teaching me to trust him. My faith is testifying as I live my faith out when nothing seems to happen. My faith is testifying about what I believe about the goodness and greatness of God. And by the way, the only way you stay faithful in failure is if your eyes are lifted up and not down here. And so God grows us in that. And by the way, the greatest failure of all history also became the greatest victory.